Hello and welcome to the History of Ceramics.
I'm Stephanie Rozene.
And I'm Paul Greenhalgh.
This is the kind of thing that you have been studying and writing about your whole life, isn't it?
I've been rather obsessed with ceramics for a long time now. I'm a professor of art history and a museum professional, so I've spent a lot of time writing and making exhibitions about ceramics. But Stephanie, you actually make it. I think that's far more important.
I do. As you know, I'm a maker, I'm a potter, and a professor of ceramic art. I've been teaching, making, and exhibiting my work around the world for several decades. And so on this very first episode, should we say something about why we wanted to make this podcast? Obviously, I think ceramic art is very important, but I'd also like to argue that ceramics changed the history of the world, and that's quite a claim.
Yes, ceramic obviously is one of our major contemporary art forms, but it's much more than this, I think. It was one of our earliest and most important technical innovations, and without it, it's hard to imagine the growth of so much else, including domestic life, international trade, the establishment of cities, and health. It's been a constant in most societies and at every level of those societies going back into the very distant past.
So in this very first episode, we thought we should go all the way back to the beginning and explore how it all started. How were ceramics discovered? Who made the first pot? And how does it help us understand these very earliest civilizations?
It's a story that takes us from an astonishing archaeological find in 1925 in what is now the Czech Republic to prehistoric China and Japan.
This is the origin story of ceramics.
Before we do anything, let's lay a few things out. Stephanie, tell us what ceramic is.
All ceramic is made from clay, but not all things made from clay are ceramic. And so what does that mean? That means that clay is a material and ceramics are the result end of a process. And so we have clays all over the globe. They're weathered geological rocks into material. We gather these materials up to make a malleable clay. And those clays can be formed into any shape. Dried, put into a furnace that we call a kiln, and heated to high temperatures. And it's that process of heating it to a high temperature that takes that clay and it transforms it into a ceramic material. And so where does that word ceramic come from?
Well, to pick up on what you say, and it is fascinating, ceramic, the word, implies far more than clay, the material itself. It implies a way of doing things. We might say it's an approach to making cultural objects, to making things in the world. The word itself actually comes from a place on the edge of Athens, and it's still there. Keramakos was the ancient Greek pottery district, where largely the potters were working on funerary pots and funerary monuments because the Greeks connected the vessel very much with their funeral rites. So Keramakos gave us the term ceramic, and then the Greek Empire expanded that around the world.
That's pretty amazing that there are these two words, ceramic and clay, and they're interrelated. But great ceramics don't just include pots. What else do they include?
Well, we know pots are very important.
We do.
They're very important. But
Yes.
in actual fact, it implies a number of media right from the very beginning. The figure and small-scale sculptural forms very much is part of the ceramic world. So it's pots and figures, but also ceramic heavily involved in architecture, the tile. So, and by tile, we might imply also larger architectural decoration and ornament. So ceramic is pots, figures, tiles, and the three are intertwined in their history, as I say, from the very earliest times. I have to say to you also, since we're talking about firsts, I searched for the first bit of writing I could find about pottery and potters. And I did find a piece of writing which I thought I would read out to you because I thought
Great.
you would find it of interest. It comes to us from 4,000 years ago, and I'll say where in a second, and I'll just read it out. The potter is under the soil, though as yet among the living. He grubs in the mud more than a pig in order to fire his pots. His clothes are stiff with clay, his girdle is in shreds. He grubs at the yard of every house and roams the public places. So, the Middle Kingdom, ancient Egypt, 2040 BC. So what do you think of that, Stephanie?
Well, I don't think it's a very flattering description, but it does describe perhaps the perception of how potters were seen. They're covered in mud. They're working and sort of toiling with this material, and they're being compared to that of a pig in a pig pen, right? Of sort of filth. And so perhaps there's a derogatory connotation there.
I would say so. Beyond that, though, there is something interesting about the fact that the person who wrote it clearly recognizes that there is a profession called potter
Yes.
and that it's a type of person.
Right. And that they're an important part of the society, of the
Yeah.
community. They wrote it in stone,
Yeah.
right? This is not just scribbling on a piece of paper. This is encapsulated for future generations to look back, perhaps judge, but also to understand the sort of critical role that the potter would have played. But we know that ceramics did not start in ancient Egypt, right? It goes much, much further in time. It's much older. Let's talk a little bit about the oldest ceramic object.
So, as I said, it was in 1925 with an astonishing archaeological find that we have our oldest objects. It's a figure rather than a pot, which is fascinating. And we think 31,000 years ago, 29,000 BC. And the object has become known as the Venus of Dolni Vestonici, a small figure of a female, about 11 centimeters high, 4.5 inches, and the first fired object we've ever uncovered. So arguably at this stage, the oldest piece of ceramic in the world. There is a fingerprint on the back of it, which has raised all kinds of interesting discussion. Archaeologists think it's the fingerprint of a child, of someone between 7 and 15 in their view. And because of that, they're not sure that that could be the maker. They think it could well be someone else. So what we should say first of all, there is a tradition of female figures in some of the earliest societies we have. We call them Venus figures, of course, that's anachronistic, but the idea would be that they are mythological, matriarchal, that they relate to religious concerns. She's an extremely well-built lady, we would say, politely. She has large breasts, she has large hips, and obviously what that refers to is the fact that she's well fed.
And she's similar to other classic Venus figures throughout prehistory. Yes.
She is absolutely.
She's not abnormal. She is within the canon.
She's within a canon, and we tend to forget because in our own age, the thinner you are, the more fashionable you are. In previous ages, getting to food and eating was seen as a sign of affluence and therefore attractive. So it's not unusual that you would have these big figures. And the matriarchal figure also implies, the richness of the land, birth and rebirth and so forth. So it's thought that she has something to do with that, I would say. There are other things that were found around her which are fascinating, and I think you will find more interesting, or at least as interesting as her. We found what have been called 2,000 balls of clay, which have burning on them. They're burnt. So a large number of rolled clay balls have been found in her proximity. So what do you make of that?
Well, I think I wonder, 2,000 balls. First of all, that would suggest some kind of production.
Yeah.
Yeah. Production of what? Because they're described as ceramic, and so that means they've been through some sort of firing process. They could be a production for something else, but it seems to me perhaps that they might be used as a building material, perhaps to build a hearth, to build, uh, figuring out that these balls of clay could be transformed into ceramic to become another material. Are they the earliest sort of bricks? This sort of scorching or sootiness on them suggests that fire was in proximity to them.
Yeah.
So, it's fascinating to me. When the first time that you sent these notes over to me about this, I thought you had put a typo in 2,000 bowls. That might make sense to me, but balls, it's sort of a conundrum. But what strikes me as also really interesting is that fingerprint on the back
Yeah.
of the Venus, and the suggestion that it's a child, but maybe not the maker.
Mm.
And when we think about prehistoric societies, people didn't live as long as we do today, right? And so is a 15-year-old person actually considered a young child? Could that be the maker? Is this a toy? Is this a religious figure? I don't know.
Mm-hmm. We don't know.
We don't know.
And the speculation is there. But I'm very much with you. 2,000 balls of clay implies process of some kind and production of some
Yes.
kind. You don't need 2,000 balls, for example, to put round a hearth. You could put balls
True,
around an awful
true,
lot of hearths
true.
with that. So we're talking about some kind of production
Right.
unit.
And some knowledge of clay, which for me
Yes.
makes the Venus figure less of a surprise.
Hmm.
They were using clay material. It's not a hard stretch to go from making a ball of clay to taking clay and forming it into a figure that is representative of sort of the heart of your community.
Yeah. And archaeologists don't think that Venus is unique. They think that there would have been lots of her. So maybe each different dwelling place would have one. We don't know. But the 2,000 bowls would imply, as we're saying,
Some kind of production.
some kind of production
So how
activity.
do we think that these early societies figured out how to take clay and turn it into a ceramic object?
You can well imagine it's been subject of endless debate amongst historians of technology and archaeologists. And one of the ways that the colleagues have discussed it through the decades, not more recently, I might add, mostly, is that somehow it was accidental, that they bumped into the idea that clay could be hardened with fire, and that led to a process. And we tend to do that with a lot of very early technologies. What do you make of that?
Well, I think I don't know that I agree that it's accidental,
No.
is what I'd have to say. Because if you took a ball of clay and you accidentally dropped it into the fire, it would explode, right? It's full of moisture on the inside, even if it is dry. That moisture converts to steam, and steam is so powerful that it will blow that thing into a million shards. And so there's got to be trial and error. There's got to be sort of learning and adaptability in these early societies, I would imagine, in order to survive all of the predators of the age. And so I strongly believe that it was not accidental, but this is what do I know? I'm not an archaeologist.
But you've got knowledge of clay, which
Right. And so
and the
there's
processes, which
something
I
that,
think is very important.
clay has to be slowly heated up during that firing process, or otherwise you will have things explode.
Hmm.
And so, could that have happened and it exploded, and then the shards of that, they realized, oh, that's different. That's almost like stone now. What could we do next? That could be a possibility.
Yeah.
But I think it's about observation and reflection and adaptability.
I couldn't agree more. I think, to steal a phrase from other disciplines, accident or design, there's design here. And I would say that we tend to underestimate how intelligent these early peoples were. They had the same size brain as us. I mean, it's been speculated their brains were bigger than us, actually. And for 100,000 years, we've been this species, at least, if not longer. And so experiment, incremental change, realization that if you carry on pushing in this direction, you might get a different result and so
Right.
forth,
Right.
which is how we do things.
Right.
It's how we do things now.
And so we can go from understanding material, learning from it, and then perhaps realizing, oh, this clay can turn into this other material. And maybe that results in the first pots. So what do we know about those first pots? How do we think that happened?
It is striking, isn't it, that we've not found a pot near Venus
Right.
on that site. Now, that does not mean that they didn't make pots. We haven't found one, but it is striking that we've not found one there. And the first and oldest pots that we found come much later, in fact. There's an almost 10,000 year gap between Venus Dolci Vestonici and the oldest shards and bits of pottery that are fired ceramic, which were found in China. So there's a 10,000 year gap. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean they didn't make pots in that period.
Right.
It means we don't know and we haven't found. And I always like to quote my favorite archaeologist in this light, Indiana Jones, who said in the first movie, archaeology is the search for fact, not truth. If it's truth you're interested in, the philosophy class is right down the hall. And what Indiana meant, I think, is that it's about things you know
Right.
to be true.
Evidence.
Now, clearly you can draw inference from things, but you need the things. You need the evidence, the real thing. And for 10,000 years, we don't have it. It's not there. But let's assume that there is a bigger story that we would ultimately hope can fill some of the gaps for us. But at this stage, the oldest pots we've got flip us over to East Asia and to China.
So we have evidence of pottery shards in China 20,000 years ago. But who knows? Archaeologists might find something much, much older. But what we do know is where the first continuous pottery tradition began. And what is extraordinary is just how old this tradition is.
Absolutely. So we're going to shift the story now from China to Japan, because it's here that the very first ongoing pottery tradition begins. Stephanie, tell us who these potters were.
Well, these potters were called the Jōmon people. And Jōmon translates as rope, and that's because they used rope to form their pottery. And so around the forms of these vessels, they're impressions of rope-like material. I suspect they wrapped rope around a piece of wood so that the clay wouldn't stick to the wood as they're paddling the vessel around. They lived in what is modern-day Japan. We know that they were nomads. They primarily lived off of seafood, and that their culture began roughly 16,000 years ago, but it lasts into the recorded historic age. And
Amazing, isn't it?
it is. And I just want to take a moment to clarify that when we're saying prehistory versus historic age, is that we're talking about writing here. In prehistory, what we have as evidence of these early societies are the pots in this case, right? And then it's not until after, generally speaking, writing begins that we can start referring to to history or the historic age. And what's fascinating about the Jōmon peoples is they made work that started in prehistory and carried on all the way into the historic age. And we know about them because of their pottery. Paul, tell us about these pots.
Well, as we're saying, they make pottery over a huge span
Yeah.
of time. And as such, we think the first and longest continuous ceramic tradition. They begin with relatively simple vessels, we would say. And as you were describing, the decoration made by pressing rope in and the coiling process. But then as the culture develops, through generations and through thousands of
Yeah.
years, they become incredibly sophisticated and
Mhm.
highly ornate and
Mhm.
decorative and truly astonishing pots.
Yeah.
And we would say, actually, as we get thousands of years into tradition, some of the most miraculous and beautiful pots that have ever been made.
Mm.
What do you make of them?
Well, I think they're fantastic. They're some of my favorite objects in the history of ceramics. The decoration is it's brilliant. It is extravagant, as you say, as the culture goes on, they become more and more and more decorative. There's sort of wild zigzags and bits of opening at the top. And so I wonder, as in most ceramic cultures that have made pots, something that might start out as a utilitarian object takes on new meanings. And so these pots, many of them, again, start as a quite narrow base, and then they flare up into this almost bell-shaped tuba form. Some of them are quite large. And in addition to the rope texture that's been impressed around them, there's additive coils, there's carved marks that dance around the top of these pots.
They're quite incredible
They're
things, aren't they?
incredible. And I remember learning that some of these, the newer, more recent forms that were even more extravagant were also used as cinerary urns. And to think that a culture could, take an object, and we've seen it through other cultures as well, where a vessel is so important to the life and the livelihood of the existence of the individual or society, that those objects are then the objects that are used as cinerary urns.
What it seems to me is that, as you say, that the purpose of the pots becomes symbolic and mythological
And
almost.
perhaps more decorative, and move away from that sort of strict utility that we see earlier in those vessels.
Absolutely, yeah. So the function, we don't know about their religion, but we know that they needed the sea. We know that they had fire and so forth. There's something elemental about those later pots, isn't there?
There is.
Earth,
There is.
fire, sea. So I would think that at some level they relate to their vision of the world, their myths and legends and religion, and that could well then relate to the funerary purpose of them. One thing's for sure, a lot of these pots have been found in relatively complete state. And that would imply, as you say, they were looked after
Yeah,
for
there's
a
a
long
value.
time and probably eventually buried, maybe with individuals. But the fact that we have them so complete shows that they were cared about.
Yes, they were important.
I know there's an issue that gets you all excited with regard to how we describe these pots, their name. But I would say probably from the 19th century, probably Japanese archaeologists, they've been known as flame pots,
Well, flame style pots, aren't they?
flame
Yes.
style
But I
pots
know
they
them
have.
as flameware pots.
And we call them that because of the decoration on the top end,
Right.
which it was thought to resemble flames. We both think that quite a lot of these pots look far more like water
It
than
does.
flame. But why do you have an issue with the idea of flame style?
Well, because I know them as flameware pots. Many potters out there will as well, because of the material they're built out of. And there's a very specific type of clay that you can put right into the hot coals or onto the gas stove contemporarily, because certain clay bodies can handle that thermal shock. And this is an example of one of them. Otherwise, we would have found all of these pots in many pieces with lots of cracks.
Right. So what we're saying is that you think the flame idea really refers to the way they're made and the technologies that these people develop.
I mean, I could get on board with sort of the flame. Some of them do have decoration that might be reminiscent of flame. So I don't discount that. But I certainly, as a maker, I just think it's an interesting kind of distinction between artists, archaeologists, and historians in terms of the similar terms we use to describe things, but that have that are rooted in different ways. Mine is rooted in a material knowledge of that clay, and yours is rooted in a visual analysis of that object.
I think it's probably a good idea that we're together doing this so that we can cover both bases. But I couldn't agree more that we tend to look stylistically into
Yeah.
other evidence as historians. What is also interesting for me is, and I know you agree with this because one of your biggest interests is the relationship of ceramic to food,
It is.
is, the intimacy with which food and ceramic is held at that time. The two go together
They do.
and they're connected through fire, which
Yes.
puts us in a very powerful primordial sense, doesn't it?
It's about transformation, isn't it?
Isn't it just?
The ceramic or the clay is transformed into the ceramic. A food ingredient is transformed into a nutritious meal that through that cooking process, the ingredients and the nutrition has become more bioavailable. It's changed the way in which communities stay healthy through the boiling of water, the cooking of meat, so that there's not disease in it. And so ceramics and food and cooking have this really intertwined
Fire,
history.
ceramic, food
Yes.
is what changed the species. Fantastic.
Agreed.
It's a wonderful thing to think of in that light. We find these pots in caches, in groups, or they have been found in groups in the past, and it gives rise to what exactly was going on. But as we were saying, they're nomads,
Yes.
and there's a sense in which it would be a very silly nomad who wanted to cart tons of kiln bricks around with them.
But they probably wanted to cart some of their pots around.
I think they
And
probably did
and
cart their
how do we
pots
think
around.
they might have done that?
Well, the term Jōmon, as we know, it refers to decoration and the way it was done, but we know also that that the rope would help them carry. So certainly they carried some. But we have found caches of the bigger pots together, and that gives rise to the implication, perhaps, that they were left in certain places.
Yeah,
that
brilliant.
These people moved from place to place and came back
Yeah.
with the seasons,
Yeah.
like many species of animals do. They move from place to place. And so the idea would be that perhaps they left the pots, they buried them and left them there, and that on occasions they did not come back. And
Or they
uncover them.
forgot where they buried them.
Or, yes, I can well imagine forgetting where one has buried one's
But
pots.
that absolutely makes sense to me because of the historic tradition of pottery. Again, they're not walking into their pottery supply store and picking up a bag of porcelain and some glaze and some tools and going home. Today, I can order material from around the world. And in fact, I do. I try to limit that for its global impact. But this pottery production arose from the site where there was clay. I am
Yeah.
sure they were not digging up clay and then transporting the clay to another location where there's a kiln. And so this idea that nomads are not just wandering the landscape, that they're moving very intentionally to these locations, perhaps with the seasons or for areas of production.
Absolutely. And the sub-point of that, which is very interesting, isn't it, is that clay has pretty heavily conditioned where people chose to live.
Yeah.
And the Jōmons perhaps were no
Well,
exception.
And of course, we have the history of ceramics because these objects were buried in tombs, in this case, in the ground for preservation. And so it's incredible to me that we have this cache of these objects because these people wanted to preserve them either for that next cycle, but in fact they did. They preserved this incredible legacy so that we have this evidence, we have those facts that you were referring to earlier.
Now, the other thing the Jōmon peoples have done is upset many archaeological theories, because as we know, one of the big theories until relatively recently, and we must remember the ancient Chinese finds and the Jōmon finds, they're in the last 20, 30
Yeah.
years, the majority
Yeah.
of them, and we've only recently been able to date them because of dating the material around them with carbon dating. So the picture has changed. There was a big assumption in what we've called the agricultural revolution of about 10,000 years ago, mainly in what we call the Fertile Crescent, which is nearer Middle East. And then the great cities grew in those areas like Mesopotamia, a place we'll certainly be talking about in coming years, in coming episodes, that 10,000 years ago, ceramic really develops there, where you have the first settled communities,
Right.
where they build their kiln sites. You know, it would seem to be a bit daft if you're a nomad carting tons of kiln bricks
Right.
around with you.
Right. Absolutely.
So
That's unreasonable.
there's a clear
Yeah.
logic that ceramic grows where you get domestication in cities. Now, I'm sure that's true, but the picture has been upset by the Jōmons
But
completely,
I think
because
the
10,000 years before that,
they're making
not 10, yeah, well, 6,000 years
right.
before that, they are clearly nomads, and they're clearly making
But they're also
ceramic.
they found a source of the ingredients, right? Of the materials in the ground through their nomadic travels. They've found the clay that works for this application, and a production happens in the place where the stuff is, right? And I certainly was told as a student that the rise of the history of pottery is concurrent with the agricultural revolution. It's where we also see this rise of cooking, right? We know that people have been cooking for over 100,000 years, but we see this real tight association between agriculture, cooking, and pottery.
Absolutely. And the Jōmon people upset the apple cart a bit. I'm not assuming, I don't think they had apples, but they upset it from the perspective that they really challenged the whole idea of an agricultural revolution as well, because we know that they did some kinds of agriculture, even though they were nomads. They learned how to develop the growth of berries and different things, and they would go back there season by season. They went to the sea to eat fish at certain times, and they domesticated animals, we now know. So they moved around, but nevertheless, they did have a whole range of things that we would now call farming. Now, we always assumed nomads didn't do that, and the pottery tells us they did.
Yeah.
And so the notion of an agricultural revolution starts to disappear. And with that, an awful lot of our assumptions go as well.
Right.
So ceramic has pushed back how we see the formation of later and modern peoples. Fantastically interesting, isn't it?
It is so fascinating. And it's amazing to me that these pottery shards can tell such stories, whether they're a complete vessel or a partial vessel. And they have been for some years and this essential element of archaeology. So without pottery, we don't know about many peoples. We know that we have these pottery shards. They're an essential element of archaeology. And we also know that the Jōmons were not the only people in prehistory named after their pottery.
No, I think the magical thing about so much of early ceramic history is that it's all we've got.
Yeah.
We know these people, these many different peoples made pots, and it's all we know about them. We know that they had that technology, and from that we imply so much. So ceramic becomes a very magical thing of the only key we have to unlocking the mystery of these very early peoples who came before us. And there is one example, I think, which is especially interesting.
Yes, the bell beaker people, right? And if those of you in Britain may be a bit familiar with these objects from about 2450 BCE. And what's left of this culture are their pottery, similar to the Jōmon. These objects are similar to modern day beakers, sort of science beakers. They have often have a flared bell with them. And so what do we know about these people, and what does their pottery tell us about them?
Well, we know that they were across quite a wide swathe of Europe, but their strongholds ultimately and their main civilizations ended up in Britain. And they're very early British peoples, and they made these ceramic vessels that we call beakers, which feels somehow appropriate to Britain, I would say. We don't think they were making tea at that stage, but the idea is that, as with so many early peoples and ongoing into the historic period, that Britain was a center of migration, wave after wave of different peoples who make us who we are.
And we know about that migration because the remnants of these objects are left behind.
100%. We know they were here because of their pots. What we don't know is they appear to disappear from the historic record. And again, there's much debate amongst archaeologists, not just with the Beaker peoples, but quite often around the world when a people seem to disappear. It was often thought that it was to do with violence, with successive waves of new people killing them off. But now the thought is that perhaps these societies, as it were, blend into one another, that they intermarry and interbreed, and from that perspective, the older culture, one of the cultures, fades, and we no longer have a clear description of them. We don't know, but what we do know, they were here at a very early stage in British history.
And so ceramics is already established at the birth of the first societies.
Absolutely it is, yes. It's what we know about these peoples. And it's almost as it were, isn't it? It's a kind of a marking point of how sophisticated a culture has become, that they have learned how to do this. It allows them to cook. It allows them to store food. And who knows? We don't have the full evidence yet. Other uses. They made their gods and goddesses and toys and so on and so on. It's a sign of sophistication
and technology.
Yes. But also community. If you're there on your own as a lone raider, you're not going to be firing pots. We're talking about peoples who've agreed to be together, like the Jōmons and like the Beaker people.
Yes.
Ceramic is clearly, as it were, one of the foundations of the growth of more sophisticated communities. Communities that work together, that had technology that allowed them to store their food, that gave them rituals, that gave them decoration. And at this stage, we've not found a use of fired ceramic architecturally yet. Tiled, it's not there. But the figures and the pots are there from the very earliest times onwards. And as we've both said, who knows how much farther we can go back. The greatest of the cave paintings in Europe are around 30 to 35,000 years old. We've now found much older paintings in different parts of the world. And my guess would be that we're going to eventually find pots that are about the same age as that. But that evidence has not yet come.
Pottery is clearly one of our most ancient technologies.
Yes.
And what is pretty fascinating is that technology we often think of as analog today when compared to digital media. But that technology is still being used in pretty much the same way. We gather up materials from the earth, we make a clay body, we form some things, we let those dry, and we put them into a kiln to fire them and change them into ceramic. These are all actions that people and societies living in prehistory discovered, figured out.
Staggeringly, what we're saying is it's a technology that we still believe in, that we make use of, and it's 31,000 years old.
Yes, and perhaps
it carries us back way into the distant past.
It does, and perhaps we use those technologies in different ways for different purposes, but it really does feel a bit like reaching across time. And as makers, we can really use this knowledge and these objects to travel through time. These ceramic objects are clues to the history of the world.
Aren't they just? And just to prove that the whole idea is time, a major factor in ceramic, we are going to next week gallop through 19,000 years to 19th century America to look at the art of someone I think is one of your heroes, Stephanie.
Indeed we are. Because we are going to be telling the story of Adelaide Alsop Robineau. She was a woman who forged her own path and put American art pottery on the world stage. She also made what has been described as the Mona Lisa of ceramics. Until then, thanks for listening.
Goodbye. To find out more and to see images of all the pieces we've been talking about in this episode and all our episodes, go to HENI.com/. youtube.com/the history of ceramics, or to the HENI Talks YouTube channel.